Hey everyone, this is David Brown. In this video, I'm going to go through a summary of the species totals from the Braddock Bay Hawk Watch Spring 2022 season. Let's start with black vulture. We had 6 black vultures this season, which was 300% of the average of 1977 through 2022. The single day high count was 2 on March 21st, which you see in the photo on the right. Here's a chart that shows the black vulture total by season, with 1977 all the way on the left up to 2022. So you can see the numbers used to be very low, with many seasons not having any. Then there was a big peak around 2010 through 2013, then a drop off, and then the past couple seasons we've been getting a handful. This was a record season for turkey vultures with over 32,000, 268% of the average, and we set a new single-day record with more than 10,000 on March 31st. And if we look at how the turkey vulture total has changed over the years, it just keeps going up and up and up, all the way up to this record season that we had in 2022. We had 182 ospreys this season, which was a bit below average, and the high count was 23 on May 20th. If we look at how the osprey total has changed over time, it started off fairly low with a jump in the mid to late 1980s. Since then it's dropped off, but we get these occasional higher years. This was a record season for bald eagles with over 1,400 and over 500% of the average. We set a new single day record with 214 on May 20th. And this chart really shows the recovery of bald eagles, where you can see in the late 70s, early 80s, hardly getting any, but just in the past 10 years or so, the numbers have really exploded up to this record season. We had 543 northern harriers, which was 67% of the average, and the single day high count was 40 on May 2nd. And if we look at the long-term trend, there's a lot of ups and downs. It started off fairly low, a couple of standout years in the late 80s and the mid 90s. Since then, it's really dropped off again. We had 2,364 sharp-shinned hawks, which was less than half of the average, and the high count was 341 on April 24th. And if we look at the long-term pattern, we see that sharp-shinned hawks have been consistently low in the past 10 or 20 years compared to what they used to be. Taking a look at Cooper's hawks, we had 217, which again was less than half of the average. High count of 14 on April 8th. And the chart for Cooper's hawks is really interesting because they started low, and then there's this massive sudden jump in the late 80s that was consistent for a number of years. And in more recent years, though, we've seen more of a declining trend. For the second year in a row, we had no northern goshawks, which are the only 2 years that has ever happened. The long-term average is 36. And looking at the chart, northern goshawks seem to go through a cycle where they'd be low and then they'd jump up really high and then back down. But really, in recent years, we have gotten away from that cycle and we don't see the big peaks anymore. And then, like I said, the past 2 seasons, we haven't had any at all. For red-shouldered hawks, we had 265, which is only 37% of the average. And the single-day high count was 100 on March 18th. And if we look at the chart, we see that in recent years, red-shouldered hawk numbers are down, but maybe it's not as bad as that percentage made it look like, because we had these years here in the late 80s, early 90s, where we had ridiculous numbers, up over 3,000 red shoulders in a season. So that really brought up the average, but overall, it looks like it is trending down. For broad-winged hawks, we had almost 21,000, which was about 3/4 of the average. And we had a really big day on April 25th when we had 12,555. It's hard to get a sense of the long-term trend for broad-winged hawks just because there's so many ups and downs, but overall you don't see an overall increase or decline, just a lot of randomness. For red-tailed hawks, we had 1,506, which was 38% of the average, and the single-day high count was 193 on April 8th. And on the chart, we see the same kind of thing where it started off low and then you get this sudden peak in the late 80s, early 90s. And then since then, it's been kind of a declining trend. We had 65 rough-legged hawks, which is only 20% of the average. And the high count was 6 on April 9th. And on the chart, we see that the rough-legged hawk total used to be consistently higher than it is now. We had this one really high peak year in 1996, and then it dropped off suddenly afterwards. But for the past 20 years or so, we see that the numbers are just quite low, especially the past 10 years. We had 28 golden eagles, which was above average, and we had a high count of 10 on April 25th. If we look at the chart, we see that recent years are consistently higher than the first 10 or 20 years of the count, although recently we haven't had any of these really high peak years. Moving on to falcons, we had 282 American kestrels, which was half of the average. The high count was 37 on April 13th. And looking at the chart for kestrels, you can almost split it in half, where we see, looks like before 1998, things were consistently higher, and then since then, it's been consistently lower. We had 34 Merlins, which was 131% of the average, with a high count of 3 on April 11th. Looking at the long-term trend, it seems like Merlins have gone up over time. You do have some of these random high years, but really for the past 4 years, the numbers have been pretty good. For Peregrine Falcon, we had 48, which was 3 times the average, and the high count was 5 on May 2nd. And the long-term trend for Peregrine Falcon seems to be consistently upward with some of these really high peak years. And we had 1 Mississippi Kite this season, which was on May 20th. And the chart for Mississippi Kite is kind of interesting because there was a period with none at all, and then it was pretty consistent every year or two, getting 1 or as many as 3. Then another period with none, and then since for the past 10 years or so, it seems like we get 1 a season or 1 every 2 years, and then occasionally 2. And if we combine everything together, we had a season total of 60,436, which was 111% of the average. And the peak day of the season was April 25th, with just over 15,000 migrating raptors. And if we look at the long-term trend for the season total, at first it was upward for a while, then it was kind of downward, except for this random year of 1996. And then since then, it's kind of climbed and maintained itself pretty steady. So overall, seems like we're doing pretty well for overall season total, but of course that's helped greatly just by the increase in the number of things like turkey vultures and bald eagles. They help offset the drops in the other species like red tails, red shoulders, kestrels, accipiters. And let me just say one more thank you to everyone who visited and helped out this season. I always have a lot of fun being the hawk counter at Braddock Bay, and it's one of my favorite places to go birding together with others. This is David Brown. Thanks for watching.